A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. Today we are continuing conversation about the 1974 uh, hearings in the Pakistani Parliament. I do understand that we are continuing this after a 2-year gap due to other activities, and you must have seen other videos on other topics that came up. With this in mind, we are starting them, but now we're starting them in English. So it should be for our younger audiences and everything else. Let me give you a bit of a background here on how these proceedings came to be. First of all, throw out from your mind whatever propaganda you've heard from the Ahmadiyya saying this was religiously motivated persecution and so on. Because if I give you the political background and then the religious background, and then I will give you a little bit of the proceedings up to the midday on the 5th of September 1974, and then we will continue on page by page from that point onwards. So in 1970, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto became the Prime Minister of Pakistan. And in the subsequent election, or that same election, he was supported by the Ahmadiyya community to a great degree. Now, the problem with a cult-like organization where you have a single leader and yes men around him is that the leader, does not understand the political realities on the ground. And the Ahmadiyya have stumbled in this matter in India and then in Pakistan and then now in the UK and probably in a few years in Canada as well. So I will come to my assertion, the proof of my assertion in a later video. But the point is that unless you have a democratic system whereby people are elected from the ground up and they can say no to the Khalifa or can criticize their leader, you will always get such situations as what happened in Pakistan in 1974. So now let me tell you a bit of what started to happen then. After the election, I'm reading from Jamil Hussein's article here. We will show it on the screen. Following the elections, many PPP is the Pakistan People's Party in Pakistan, of which Bhutto was the leader. Many PPP MNAs and MPAs visited Rabwah, Punjab, and got a good reception from the Qasr Khilafat. Khudam al-Ahmadiyya organized parties and contributed funds for the PPP public meetings. Qadiani students joined PPP-led student federations to check the activities of Jamiyat-e-Tulaba, the student wing of Jamaat-e-Islami, which was in opposition to the PPP. So before that, in Pakistani history, the Jamaat-e-Ahmadiyya Qadianiya. So when I say Qadiani, I don't mean that as a pejorative. It's just to distinguish them from the Lahori group. We'll come to that in a subsequent video. But Jamaat became politically active around that time, and the person coordinating this political activism was Mirza Tahir Ahmad, who was the younger brother of Mirza Nasir Ahmad, stepbrother, and who would later go on to become their fourth head. So Jamaat dabbled in politics deliberately, siding with the PPP, and the religious parties were antagonistic to the PPP and they were in opposition at that time. So that gives you a clear indication of where the Jamaat stood at that time on the political spectrum. A powerful group among the bureaucracy and the military extended support to Rabwah to win its favors for future promotions. Many high-ranking army officers and civil servants belonged to the Jamaat. So a recommendation from the Khalifa to promote somebody who was not Ahmadi would be channeled to somebody in the army who was Ahmadi and a higher position. And because that Ahmadi person had to follow the instructions of his Khalifa, that was almost guaranteed promotion for the other person. Do you see what I'm trying to get at here? If not, you can ask a question. This is being recorded in front of a live remote audience. So this is the reason why after this amendment was passed, no Ahmadi or Qadiani can get the rank of above a colonel in the army, in the Pakistan Army anymore, because of this specific situation that what we are describing now. Yes, we have one question on the screen. So the question is, why Colonel? Why not something else? So Colonel, my answer to that would be it's an arbitrary line drawn in the ranks of the military, and that is after Colonel, the next step is Brigadier General. You are now part of the General Staff, where were responsible for the strategy of the government, and you lead non-combat strategic operations. Is that okay? Good. So this same question was asked of John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election in the United States. He was asked point blank. He was the first and probably the last, the only, not the last, Catholic president of the United States. He was asked whether he would follow the Pope or the United States Constitution or the United States law on a matter that was close to his heart. And his answer was, without any doubt, I would follow the US Constitution and the law, and underlying between the lines, ignore the Pope. Now, the Ahmadi cannot do that. The Ahmadi is bound by his pledge of allegiance to be bound to the Ahmadi Khalifa. And this Khalifa's intervention in the armed forces was one of the reasons why we reached the events of 1974. I'm going to read out the excerpts to you. Because of this political power that Mirza Nasir Ahmad had accumulated by supporting the PPP, he was happy over his political bargain. He declared that majority of Muslims had accepted the Qadiani point of view over the vital religious issues. In Said House, Abbottabad, he declared that the majority of people had accepted our interpretation on the belief of the death of Jesus Christ and Khatm al-Nabuwwat, the finality of prophethood. This is from the newspaper Al-Fazl, 30th June 1972. This edition is not online. I have checked it. So he, in a state of hubris and not being challenged by his subordinates, reached the conclusion that, wow, we have spiritual victory as a result of our political victory in the elections. He tried to conflate the two issues, and this is what happened with cults, if you understand what I'm trying to say here. And then he said, after an year, in 1973, he claimed that 70 to 80% people, especially the young generation of Pakistan, had come to believe that Ahmadis were not non-believers in Khatm al-Nabuwwat. Like the issue of Jesus' death, the issue of Khatm al-Nabuwwat would finish in the next 5 or 7 years, he predicted. Al-Fazl, 28th July 1973. Again, this edition is not available online. So Mirza Nasir Ahmad, as a result of his political connections and the powerful Ahmadis in the army and so on, also had this perception that the religious parties that always said that Ahmadis were non-Muslims had been marginalized, and he had, quote unquote, won a victory. And this concept of victory of Ahmadiyyat ki fatah, is the guiding principle that keeps the cult together. They say that eventually they will overwhelm all the Muslims and their quote unquote real Islam will emerge from the Ahmadiyya movement. Now, this is extremely far-fetched. If you're Ahmadi, I'm sorry to say that, but it's a fool's paradise. It's something that the cult has ingrained in you in order to hide their exploitation of you and your money and your family and your resources. We have another question, yes. Is there a parallel between the victory of Ahmadiyyat and Mormonism? No. So Mormonism does not seek to supplant Christianity in the way the Ahmadiyya plan to supplant Islam as part of their whole prophetic nature. So yes, that is one of the places where there is no parallel. Thank you. Then in 1973, the oil crisis hit the world, and it was deemed necessary to check any movement to forge a common front against Western powers. In 1974, Bhutto announced the convening of the Islamic Summit in Pakistan. It baffled Rabwah. The leading role of Saudi Arabia in the summit was a red rag to the Qadiani bull. Mirza Tahir says that the Saudi King Faisal aspired to be the Khalifa of the Muslim world. Thus, the fate was Faisal by his niece. He was murdered by his Americanized nephew. However, an anti-Ahmadiyya movement was launched on the eve of the Islamic summit, and a lot of literature was distributed among the Muslim delegates. Now, this needs to be clarified. Ahmadiyya people, again in their own whim and fancy, say that the Islamic summit was convened to counter the Ahmadiyya. Now, again, this may be self-serving for the cult leaders, but the Ahmadiyya were and continue to be an insignificant minority in Pakistan that create problems much, much, much above their population and their weight. So, the reason for the Islamic summit was the oil crisis and the nascent Islamization of many Arab countries. So that was the reason behind the Islamic summit. Now, the opposition Islamic parties were in opposition to the People's Party in Pakistan. They tried to use the occasion as a rallying point to get the Qadianis declared non-Muslim. So the two events were coincidental in time, but because of two very different political reasons. And any student of political science and history will agree with me. And you might also agree that a cult cannot survive until it bends history or changes history to suit its purposes. The Ahmadiyya Qadiani community have never been an existential threat to Islam or to any country so far. So the question is, has any cult ever managed to change history or attempted to change history? Yes, every cult tries to change history or interpret history in the way that that fits their narrative, that keeps their members inside the fold. Has any cult succeeded? No. Even if we think of the Catholic Church or other big religious movements at this time, like the Wahhabi movement or other movements in Islam or other religions, none comes to my knowledge that has succeeded in making its narrative of history. Yes, the Shia have their own narrative of history. Mormons may have their own, but making that the mainstream accepted historical narrative. So, as a afterthought to your question, I would say to my Ahmadi viewers, don't learn history from your Khalifa, learn history from the history books, learn history from the newspapers, and I'm going to quote a few newspapers here. Learn history from the professors of history. Don't call them biased. There are Hindus, Christians, Muslims, and agnostic and atheist professors of history, and learn history from them. They're not biased against you. No history is biased against any religious organization. Learn politics from the political people. If you want to learn politics and history from your Khalifa and from your Murabbis, you're not going to get anywhere because that is just their self-serving cult purposes. And of course, you can learn history and your politics from what Ahmadiyya from us in our videos. So going up here, these events created an atmosphere of mistrust between the PPP and Rabwah. Rabwah meaning the Ahmadiyya, Qadiani Ahmadiyya. However, they still enjoyed the support of several key figures of the ruling party. And then, but the mood of the community, the mood of the Qadiani community became very aggressive. They wanted to show Bhutto that we had, quote unquote, this is attributed to Mirza Nasir. I'm not sure whether it's true or not, that we brought you to power and we can take you away from power. This statement has been repeated in history a lot of times, and more often than not, this has proven to be false. The people bringing you to power are not the people who will take you away from power. Then Qadianis attacked the students of the Nistar Medical College in Multan, which you can read about in and listen to our video in the first part of this this series. And Qadianis carried sticks and arms. 50 students were badly injured, 13 in critical condition. This is Delhi Jasarat, Karachi, 31st May 1974. It was a pre-planned affair, and Mirza Nasir and Mirza Tahir were behind the game. This is absolutely true. Our AK Sheikh Sahib in the first video of this series told us that he was one of the motorcycle people who went after the train and spied on the student having a picnic, so that when they were coming back on the train, they could be ambushed and assaulted in Rabwah. And I have lived in Rabwah, and I know that nothing happens in Rabwah without the express authorization of the leader of the cult, which is Mirza Nasir. Now, the way they operate is that they have this concept called deniability, which is many top leaders of the world have that concept where they would give an order in non-exact terms to certain trusted lieutenants who know how to execute it. But again, the actual execution cannot be traced back to the leader. That is a concept with Richard Nixon, with other people all over. In Canada, Prime Minister Harper, in the UK, Prime Minister Blair, and so on. So this is a technique often employed by people who call deniability. But nothing happens in a cult or in a cult-controlled town or in a religious-controlled town without the desire and the will of the leader. Okay, Prime Minister Blair is not the Prime Minister anymore, ex-Prime Minister. Thank you. Now, because of this incident, again, the government did not react, but there was a certain amount of public unrest and attacks on Ahmadis all over the country because of this. Unleashed violent reaction all over Pakistan. Hanif Rameh, the Chief Minister of Punjab, issued stern warnings to lawbreakers, and yet the demonstrators paid no heed to it. Mr. Justice K.A. Samdani, a High Court judge, was appointed to hold an inquiry into the Rabwah incident. In the Punjab Assembly, the leader of the opposition moved adjournment motion, but the speaker disallowed it on the ground that the matter was sub judice. Pakistan Times, Rawalpindi, 3rd May 1974. Bhutto appealed to the people to wait for the results of the tribunal, but the movement continued unabated. The opposition leaders in the National Assembly made stern efforts to move an adjournment motion on Rabwah incident without any success. The Assembly devoted most of the time to procedural debate on the admissibility of such a motion. To check the rising movement, many religious and political leaders were arrested under the DPR, Defense of Pakistan rules, and public meetings declared unlawful. Kohistan, Lahore, 10th May 1974. The government used repressive measures to find an excuse to revive the 1953 macabre drama, to shelve the issue. People bore all hardship with fortitude to carry out the movement in a peaceful manner. Everybody knew that the man behind the Qadiani Gundaism was Mirza Nasir. The government was, however, reluctant to arrest him. However, he filed a petition for bail before arrest in Lahore High Court. He was associated with the investigation into the Rabwah incident. Pakistan Times, 7 June 1974. So now this attack on the students at the Rabwah station was inspired by Mirza Nasir. He got bail from the court before, and the government didn't want to arrest him. Now, with the Fakhruddin Multani case, read up on it on the wiki site. We'll give you a link here. We can see that a very similar situation happened in Qadian with the second Khalifa in 1937, where the Khalifa and his speeches were behind the murder of an opponent, not an opponent, a person who had reneged, had gone back on the Ahmadiyya movement and had left the Ahmadiyya movement, citing the corruption of its leader. And he was murdered on, and the British government at the time said, we are not going to arrest the leader unless it's not politically expedient to arrest the leader unless we have real proof against him. Now, my advice to the Pakistani government is that in case an event like that happens in the future, go and arrest him. The government are afraid that people will rebel, or the Ahmadiyya people will have a very violent reaction. That is not going to happen. The Ahmadiyya people is a cult-like environment. If you cut off the head, or if you, not cut off, that's the wrong phrase to use, if you disable the head or arrest him, the movement will go quiet. Without a central head, there is nobody in the middle tiers who will have the authority or will have the strategy to take this forward. Yeah, so the question is, what will stop the general population of Ahmadis from rioting? Yes, the Ahmadis will, if at any time their head of government is arrested in Pakistan or the UK or anywhere else, there will be immediate visceral reaction from the Ahmadiyya community. But what I'm trying to say is that they do not have the organizational, heft or the organizational structure to be able to withstand a blow like that without having a temporary leader. And the problem with the Ahmadiyya is that their Khalifa comes from the Mirza family, the family of the founder, and his subordinates are all commoners or mostly commoners. So somebody would have to step up. And the big risk here for the Mirza family is that somebody who steps up will create a following within the Ahmadiyya that will eclipse the Mirza family. So because of this thing, they don't have people who can be decisive and strategic enough to be able to guide the movement in such situation. Now, this is also to some degree a parallel between the MQM. Altaf Hussain, the government of the UK wanted to arrest Altaf Hussain. They arrested him and then released him on bail, and there was a widespread situation in Karachi. And now what the Pakistani government is trying to do is trying to distance the MQM followers from their cult-like leader, so that any future action by the British government can be contained. So if you get my drift, you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. Now, Mirza Tahir Ahmad fled Pakistan in 1982 because he was being sought on an arrest warrant for a fake case, but he fled. So at that time, the specter of an arrest was quite real, and this is the reason why he fled, and not he could have applied for bail, and if he was not given justice, it would have been a cause for the martyrdom of for the Ahmadiyya and somebody else. But the whole problem was that in his absence, who would have led the community? And that second tier is not fit to lead the community in any way. It's not a proper hierarchical structure. It's the Mirza family at the top and a lot of followers on the second tier. Does that answer your question? Good. So then the Samdani tribunal, which was a tribunal that was set up to look into the occurrence that happened, the violent event that happened on the Rabwah Charabnagar, now the name is now Charabnagar railway station, in 1974. The Samdani tribunal was conducting its investigations. Statements of the witnesses who appeared before the Samdani tribunal appointed to investigate the cause of Rabwah gave an awful picture of Qadianiyat, hitherto less known to the world. So the Samdani commission exposed the internal structure of the Ahmadiyya within Rabwah, a state within a state. So the hubris of having contributed to the PPP led to the aggressive, violent reaction of Ahmadi goons on the Rabwah railway station, that led to the Samdani commission, that led to the insight into the Ahmadiyya structure, which was not widely known outside the community. And this is why people are against me and against AK Sheikh and Shahid Kamal and others, because we know the community from inside. And a cult's biggest problem is an insider telling an outside judicial inquiry what the internal organization of the cult is. So this is again a message for the authorities in UK, US, and Canada, and Germany as well. What the Samdani Commission heard, that the Khudam al-Ahmadiyya is the military or paramilitary organization of the Ahmadis. Not quite. A subset of the Khudam al-Ahmadiyya is. They're very highly trained, and they're inculcated with the belief that Jamaat will soon hold the reign of power, and they will be the enforcers of that power. During any security incident in Rabwah, the Khudam al-Ahmadiyya patrol I used to be part of those patrols, would patrol the boundaries of Rabwah, conceal weapons, legal weapons, carry weapons, beat up people, and so on, and put up checkpoints, and all that kind of stuff was done by a subset of the Khudam al-Ahmadiyya. The Khudam al-Ahmadiyya is all the people, all the men in Ahmadiyya from age 15 to 40. Qadiani officials are instructed by the Khalifa to manage jobs through all legal or illegal means for Ahmadis. Yes. So getting a job, getting somewhere, the end justify the means. That is the point of the Ahmadi. Khalifa says do something, and if the person has to employ any means to do it, he will do it. Um, in Africa, Ghulam Ahmad, the founder, is projected as Prophet Ahmad. Yes, now it's all over the world. Thanks to Mirza Masroor, the current head, he has removed that ambiguity around Mirza Ghulam Ahmad being a prophet. But this ambiguity existed back then. There is existed in Rabwah a force called the Furqan Force. Yes, that was a paramilitary organization, all Ahmadi, that fought in Kashmir in 1947. General Gracie, who was the commander-in-chief of Pakistan Armed Forces at that time, had disbanded his organization. The arms and ammunition were sent to Wagah through a military wagon and buried near Mahmud Mosque. Volunteers were posted. Okay, Ahmadiyas have a mission in Israel. That's fine. And then how they sent missionaries to Israel was sent a Pakistani to an African country on a Pakistani passport, get another passport from the African country to go to Israel. No Jews have been converted to Islam. Pakistan Times, 28 June 1974. So this was a witness who testified before the Samdani Commission. Now, at the height of this protest movement, this is what we are experiencing today. The Qadiani propaganda machinery was actively engaged in mustering international support. Mirza Nasir Ahmad gave an interview to the Associated Press of America, AP. He said, "I'm convinced that due to many reasons, Prime Minister Bhutto's PPP has engineered the riots. One reason is that the PPP wants to prop up its crumbling prestige by winning over the support of the extremists of other sects." So again, now you see the political stuff. He's trying to attack back the political party that he thought he had brought into power. Sarzafullah Khan alleged that the properties were being burned by rioters and the federal security forces stood by as silent spectators. This is a lie. The government did everything in its power to stop the riots. Yes, a few Ahmadis were killed, less than 100. Properties were burnt and looted, but the government did crack down very violently on the rioters. So this statement by Zafrullah Khan again shows you the cultishness of this organization, that even a person such as Zafrullah Khan, who had been a justice on the World Court and who had been a foreign minister, was not above lying when it suited the purpose of his master, the Khalifa. And this is the reason why Pakistanis are now barred from senior civil service and senior military positions in Pakistan until they develop the internal character that is required for such senior positions. This is a quote from the Daily Jasarat, Karachi, 28 June 1974. Also, it is mentioned in an Ahmadi book by B.A. Rafiq. And then this Rabwah incident was ascribed to Bhutto and Shah Faisal's policy by The Economist. A paper such as The Economist said, several months ago when an Ahmadi was fired as Chief of Staff of Air Force, so there was an insubordination or a coup in the Air Force, and one of the people who was fired was the head of the Air Force, who happened to be a Qadiani Ahmadi. So, the other people in this investigation by the military of Pakistan were not accepted the tribunal, but this person who was the head of the Air Chief Force was not, Chief of the Air Force did not accept the findings of the tribunal. This is The Economist, London, 15 June 1974, and The Economist told the official line of the Ahmadiyya at that time. And then on 5th June in 1974, Zafrullah Khan held a press conference in London and said that, and admitted in the Times of London, 7 June 1974, that there was a violent reaction in Rabwah. And then Zafrullah Khan went to Amnesty International, International Red Cross, Human Rights Commission, International Commission of Jurists, Oxfam, and go and help the suffering Ahmadis. He wrote to UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim to send observers to Pakistan. Ahmadiyya missions in US, UK, Nigeria, and other countries met with the government officials. The Washington Post carried a front page article sympathetic to Ahmadis and blatantly insulting to the people of Pakistan and Muslims in general. This is on 30th September 1974. And then the government of Pakistan was taken aback by all this international reaction. Yes, a little incident happened in Pakistan, comparatively little to other incidents or that have happened around the world at that time when millions were slaughtered by Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot in the world. And the Pakistan Times was perplexed. Now, this is the time when the Pakistani English press was very left-leaning. So we are not sure what extent Pakistan foreign accusers have been influenced by the statements of Mirza Nasir Ahmad and Saad Zafarullah. But it is clear that by lapping up whatever was said by these gentlemen, they acted in fairness neither to them nor to Pakistan. Similarly, the worthy spokesmen of Ahmadiyya community have only harmed their own cause by securing for foreign help against their own government and rendered themselves liable to the charge that they care more for their international connections than their loyalty to the land where they have enjoyed extraordinary facilities and privileges. Indeed, they are more guilty of sullying the image of their country than their friends abroad. Pakistan Times, 25th June 1974. So the Ahmadiyya were given a state within a state, and they were given political and organizational leeway, much more. Even now, a case against an Ahmadi once in a while requires clearance from very senior people before you can file a case against an Ahmadi against Pakistani laws. So Ahmadis have always been protected, and they have been successful community in Pakistan despite what their leaders have done. Now, let me point it out here, as I have pointed out in other of my videos. Sometimes there is a backlash against the Shia community, there's backlash against the Aga Khani community in Pakistan because of extremism and terrorism in Pakistan, which we all know. Rarely would you see those communities being disloyal to Pakistan and unleashing anti-Pakistan fervor against their communities. Meanwhile, the Ahmadiyya community in the US and Canada particularly, without rhyme or reason, are always anti-Pakistan in every publication outside the country. So this precedent was set at that time. So why are they anti-Pakistan, and what do they hope to accomplish? Very good question. Because the whole purpose of the cult is to keep its followers in thrall. Now, one of the articles I'm writing these days is that this is not going to change the ground reality in Pakistan in the next 50 years. So the whole purpose of this is to keep the Pakistani government under pressure, for one reason. Number two, and I'm being very cynical here, to incite further hatred against the community in Pakistan. Because now the business of the Ahmadiyya Qadiani community is refugee asylum chanda. Get people out. Now, this year, 2 people have died in Pakistan, one in Karachi, and it was made into an international incident. Now, there is a crackdown in Karachi, crime rates have gone down, and many people from many communities have been killed. There is a problem in Karachi, or problem in the rest of Pakistan. My question to the Ahmadis is that they say their population in Pakistan is 10 million, 3 million, 4 million. The real number is around 200,000. Okay. Now, if you extrapolate this percentage, their self-claimed percentage in the population against the actual terrorism acts or actual judicial actions or extrajudicial murders in Pakistan, their number is less than 1/20th of what it would be just by virtue of the proportion of their population. Does that make sense? So just if they claim their population in Pakistan to be so and so, they would have 10 times or 20 times more people killed or people victim of terrorist incident than they actually are. So this is now mere propaganda. There is a team of 20 or 30 people waiting for the next event to happen. And that is a sad situation. It's a sad situation for my Ahmadi friends in Pakistan. That you have a community that is being victimized by their own leaders outside Pakistan. And the only silver lining that we have seen is that the Canadian Ahmadiyya community has now, on the 14th of August 2015, held a Pakistan Day in their place of worship. So they are probably starting to realize that this anti-Pakistani sentiment, you will only get them so far. Does that answer your question? Okay. So Zafrullah Khan said that at least 20% were killed in Rabwah, and therefore which was false. No of the facts was a bolt from the blue and a stab in the back for people of Pakistan. Gross exaggeration of the whole incident. Zafrullah played well to the tunes of his masters. Let us try to identify his masters. You will find them in Washington, London, Delhi, and now most probably willing connivers in Moscow as well, be it Rafiq. Despite mass protests, Bhutto continued his partisan attitude and support to Qadianis. Qadianis should never forget that Bhutto tried his level best, despite everything else, to contain the riots against the Ahmadis. He tried to put all the blame into foreign hands. Opposition wanted Bhutto to come away from this position, and then the opposition were against the large-scale appointments of Qadiani Ahmadis to sensitive military posts. Two of the three military chiefs belonged to the Qadiani community at that time. Bowing to public pressure, on 30th June 1974, the government announced to place the entire matter before the National Assembly of Pakistan in the form of two resolutions, one by the government, the Law Minister Abdul Hafiz Pirzada, and the other by the opposition, 37 members, including Abdul Haq, Sherbaz Mazari, Professor Ghafoor Ahmed, and Haji Maula Baksh Somro. The government, this is the resolution that led to the parliamentary hearings. This was accepted by the Qadiani head, who was again under the misconception that he was going to win. Now, let me tell you a little bit of theological history. Mirza Mahmud Ahmad introduced a lot of theological stuff into the Ahmadiyya doctrine. He was the founder of the Qadiani branch of the Ahmadiyya, and which were absolute anathema to Muslims. And he introduced them before the creation of Pakistan in British India. Now, he knew what he had done. So in 1953, in the Munir inquiry, he backtracked. He moved away from those things. He knew what he had done. Mirza Nasir Ahmad, his son, on the other hand, had grown up hearing those things. He actually believed them to be true. And that led to his downfall. So he thought that he could go before Parliament and win the day. And as we'll find out in the rest of the proceedings, what happened. Both the House committee set up a select committee comprising of the leaders of various groups in the assembly. Everybody was present, and unanimous verdict, which we will come back to that later. Now, let me now go back to the proceedings. The proceedings were classified by the Pakistani government, and that classification is a boon to the Ahmadiyya community. Otherwise, they would have been a laughing stock at that time. The kind of mistakes and errors that Mirza Nasir Ahmad, the head of the Qadiani community, did in front of the community at that time. In 2011-2012, on the appeal of, on the request of a certain person, those transcripts were released into the public domain. Now here is, if you hear in Urdu, the first video in this series, you will find out that the Ahmadis claim for 40 years that when those proceedings come out, and I heard it with my own ears in 1976-77, that when those proceedings emerge from classification, half of Pakistan will become Ahmadi. That is how they fool you. That is how they fool you. Now, just before they were released, 2 or 3 years before, we have the video clips in part 1 of this series. The Ahmadiyya still maintained that, bragged that not all of Pakistan, not half of Pakistan, all of Pakistan would become Ahmadi if those proceedings were laid bare. So when those proceedings came out in 2011, guess what? Ahmadiyya tried for a few weeks to say, oh, they are not the proper proceeding, something has been omitted, look for the audio, look for this, look for that. Now they have generally accepted, yes, these are the proceedings. But they continue every 6th of September, 7th of September, they write articles all over in the Western media denigrating Pakistan and considering that this was not the right decision. Now, there have been laws passed after this amendment, which I don't consider very good laws, but this constitutional amendment there was no popularly elected government that would not have sooner or later come to the same conclusion regarding the Ahmadis if the Ahmadis did not backtrack from their political and propaganda campaigns. Okay, so now because the Ahmadis had been, so the question is, what was the reasoning behind this claim that half or the whole of Pakistan would become Ahmadis? The reasoning is that they had been defeated, and Mirza Hasir Ahmad had made an utter fool of himself in the parliament, and he was accompanied by five of his scholars that were all under the Mahmud delusions, the Mahmudi additions to the Ahmadiyya religion, and they could not respond. And again, because the Khalifa, the top guy, was not as smart as his subordinates, and they could not object to him. They considered him the fountain of all knowledge. Therefore, they had done very poorly. And because of that, the Pakistani Assembly had unanimously declared Ahmadis as non-Muslim. Now, a rational organization would have tried to backtrack, like Mirza Mahmud did in 1953, and tried to build bridges with Pakistan and slowly reintegrate themselves into the mainstream of the community. See what had gone wrong. Try to understand it. But a cult that is interested in only money wants to make refugees and send them abroad. So the only way they could justify their defeat, the only way they could explain their defeat to Ahmadis was saying all of Pakistan is a liar. All the members of parliament were liars. All of them were biased. Even the very liberal prosecutor, Jaja Bakhtiar, who later on became the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, very liberal person, was against Ahmadis. And this has been sealed by the government. It was sealed on the request of the Ahmadis, so says the government. It was sealed just because they cannot bear to show the world how we won there. That was the line. That line failed miserably. Okay? And a lot of people have been affected by this release. And a lot of people, thinking people, have left the Jamaat because of this. Make sense? Okay. So now, coming to the proceedings, 5 more minutes, and then coming to the proceedings started in Parliament, and the prosecutor, Jaja Bakhtiar Sahib, who was the Attorney General of Pakistan at that time, started off very finely with trying to ascertain whether Mirza Nasir Ahmad represented his community, how big the community was. Mirza Nasir Ahmad said, yes, I do represent the community, because Jaja Bakhtiar Sahib, the Attorney General, was trying to determine whether Mirza Nasir Ahmad may backtrack after the whole proceeding and say, oh, the Anjuman, which is the corporation directors of the Ahmadiyya, they are the ones who are ultimately responsible and not him. So, and then he wanted to ask about his grandfather and his position in the community. He was called the Khalifa, the Amirul Mu'mineen, the leader of the faithful, which was the title reserved for the Muslim Khalifas of the past. And after that, he gave his first argument, which was the argument of the branding, that if somebody uses your brand, if the Ahmadis say they are the real Muslims, and they use certain epithets that are specific to Islam, like Sahaba and Radiallahu Anhu and so on, and he gave the example of Lever Brothers, if they have a trademark on a certain name, would you use the same name, and so on. That argument we will not cover in our English part of this series, because that has already been covered in the prior 2 videos. We'll proceed now with the next argument. So we will only be able to cover a short portion of the second argument. I'm starting on page number 80 of the proceedings, because I had to give you the background. In our next tape, we will cover more of the proceedings. If you have any questions about this background that I have given, please feel free to ask, and we will address it in our next video. So the prosecutor on page number 80 says, now, sir, reverting back to freedom of religion under Article 20, because Ahmadis claim that the freedom of religion enshrined in Article 20 of the Constitution is absolute. And I will go further in this video and explain how the freedom of religion is never absolute. it says every citizen shall have the right to profess, practice, and propagate his religion. Now, will you please tell me the forms of practice, not only Islam, I'm not talking of it, generally religion, and what does it mean, and how do you profess and how you practice in your mind? Mirza Nasir replied in Urdu, हर मजहब के अकायद जो हैं उसके नतीजे में जो कुछ इबादत हैं, that whatever the beliefs of a faith and the worship, the forms of worship that result from there, whatever Allah has said that you should worship. For example, Christians, they go to church, this is a worship, this is their worship, and this has a certain method to it, that they have some song and music along with it. That is their way. And because Islam is a beloved religion, Islam announced through the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Joilat al-Ardu Masjidan, that the whole world has been made a mosque for the Muslim. That if somebody is so far away from the mosque that it's a time for Asr prayer, and he would not be able to reach the mosque, so wherever he is, he should pray the prayer right there. Christians don't have that benefit; they do it on their own, and a Muslim says the prayer, observes the prayer in his own way, and the schools of thought within the Islam have their own specific ways. He used the word firqe, sects, although most Muslim scholars call it masalik, or schools of thought. The Attorney General says in English, his practice is only confined to prayers, or is it more than? Some rituals are also involved. Mirza Nasir Ahmed says, Islam में तो नमाज और रोज़ा और ज़कात और हज और कलिमा शहादत का ऐलान जो है, in Islam the 5 pillars of faith, they have the Eid. And Eid, we have a very strong relationship to Eid. It is a very subtle and big concept, philosophy in Eid. I don't want to go in there. There are 2 Eids, and they come after 2 sacrifices, and in addition to that, there's Hukukul Ibad, the rights of human beings in Islam. I have not counted them, but people who have counted them say that there are about 700 such rights of Hukukul Ibad in the Quran, and if all of those conditions are fulfilled, they have to be fulfilled by humans. This is what we think is a ritual, what I understand from you. The Attorney General says, मैं सीख रहा हूँ, I ask you. Mirza Nasir Ahmed says, मैंने नहीं पढ़ा कि वो ritual का लफ्ज़ उनके ऊपर इस्तेमाल हो रहा हो जो मुसलमान हो, ईदैन के ऊपर हो जाता है. Now the discussion is, Mirza Nasir is saying is that the word ritual, maybe Eid is ritual, but he is not trying to understand, or they're not agreeing on what this ritual means. Yahya Bakhtiyar says in Urdu, यानी मैं वो कहता हूँ मेरे दिमाग में Indian authorities हैं कुछ. Mirza Nasir Ahmed says, so he says, I have in mind the Indian authorities. Mirza Nasir Ahmed says, okay. Yahya Bakhtiyar says in Urdu, वहाँ जो ईद पर बकर ईद पर गाय की कुर्बानी करते थे, and you may have seen those cases in English. There are people who slaughter cows in India. Mirza Nasir Ahmed says, yes. Yahya Bakhtiyar says, वहाँ उन्होंने Prevention of Cow Slaughter Act बनाया हुआ है कि गाय को ज़िबा. They have an act there in India saying you cannot slaughter cows in India. Mirza Nasir says yes. Yahya Bakhtiyar, and for religion, is this part of the practice of religion or not? He says in Urdu. Mirza Nasir Ahmed says yes, you're right. Our Eids, our orders are of 2 types: those which are a must and those which are not a must, but they are allowed. If there is any law against those in any country of the world, so the person will not be a sinner. Now this is the key point in this testimony. I will bring this back to you later. Yahya Bakhtiyar, the attorney, says, fundamental from the point of view of foundational rights, is it guaranteed in the Indian constitution and similar or terms more or less. Mirza Nasir, whatever a religion has permitted in terms of fundamental rights, how can they oppose it? Jaja Bakhtiar, वो तो उन्होंने की है कि yes, the Indian government has violated this right of Muslims. Mirza Nasir, नहीं, fundamental rights जो हैं, the fundamental rights. Jaja Bakhtiar, fundamental rights says you can practice your religion in all the world. Mirza Nasir, religion कहता है कि तुम्हारे लिए जरूरी नहीं गाय को ज़िबा करो. The religion says it is not compulsory on you to sacrifice cows. There is no clash in this case in the examples you give here. हमारा मजहब इस्लाम ये नहीं कहता कि गाय को जरूर ज़िबा करो. Our religion Islam does not say that the cow must be slaughtered. A cow must be slaughtered. जाजा बख्तियार, अभी अगर एक आदमी के पास सिर्फ गाय है बकर ईद पर और वो बेचारा इसको कुर्बान, if a person has only a cow remaining with him and he wants to slaughter that on the Eid, Mirza Nasir says, our religion does not say that every man has to slaughter an animal on the Eid of sacrifice. Jaja Bakhtiar says, no, it says that if I have the money and I have the cow and I want to, and I have the cow, Mirza Nasir says, if he has the money and then he can go and buy a ram with a lot of fat, a sheep with a lot of fat. Jaja Bakhtiar says, और ये बताइए कि is this not the freedom of religion? कोई interference नहीं होगा आपके साथ अगर मिर्जा नासिर अहमद, there will be no interference in you if you do that. मिर्जा नासिर अहमद, जहाँ जवाज है वो जोब नहीं, वहाँ वो जहाँ जवाज है वो जोब नहीं, वहाँ नहीं होगा. It's a slightly misprint. He is saying no, it won't apply where there is a way out. If Jaja Bakhtiar says, if the butcher says कि this is affecting our freedom of trade, we cannot slaughter cows. मिर्जा नासिर, अगर कसाई ये कहे कि मैं सिवाय गाय के, जाजा बख्तियार, मैं गाय का गोश्त बेचता हूँ, मैं सिर्फ गाय का गोश्त बेचता हूँ और बकरी के गोश्त भी बेच नहीं सकता. मिर्जा नासिर अहमद सेज, हाँ मैं बेचता हूँ, मेरा बाप दादा यही प्रोफेशन था. मिर्जा नासिर अहमद सेज, नहीं वो प्रोफेशन है, वो कोई फ़र्क नहीं. जाजा बख्तियार, नहीं. मिर्जा नासिर, तो हमात की दुनिया में जनाब जाजा बख्तियार आप इजाज़त देते हैं कि स्टेट शुड इंटरफेयर इन दीज मैटर्स. So now the discussion is that a butcher whose profession was to slaughter cows says, I'm being affected by this law. The Attorney General is asking Mirza Nasir, do you allow such a law to affect the butcher in this matter? Mirza Nasir Ahmad, it is not interference in the freedom of trade. इस वास्ते के बगैर किसी नुकसान के गोश्त बेच सकता है. He can still sell meat without a loss to himself. आप लेते हैं कि प्रोफेशन है, जो ट्रेड है गोश्त बेचने की, आपने उसकी तारीफ ये की है गाय का गोश्त बेचना. You have defined the profession as a person who sells cow meat. Now Mirza Nasir has fallen into the legal trap here, you know. और मैं तारीफ ये करता हूँ गोश्त बेचना. I define a butcher as a person who sells meat. This is what Mirza Nasir says, not necessarily cow meat. The meat can be cow or can be a goat. Jaja Bakhtiar says, Constitution says, any lawful profession or trade. Now this was lawful when the fundamental rights came into existence. Then the law was promulgated. After that, Mirza Nasir, then it was not lawful after the promulgation of the law. Jaja Bakhtiar, the law as Article 8, our Article 8 says similar. The Indian parallel article says corresponding article number. Mirza Nasir interrupted. Any law which is conflict with Mirza Nasir. मैं बड़ा जाहिल आदमी हूँ. मुझे आपकी ये दलील से he is being sarcastic here. I am stupid person, an ignorant person. I don't understand your argument. जाजा बख्तियार, बहरहाल आप मिर्जा नासिर समझ नहीं आई. जाजा बख्तियार समझती हैं कि ये लॉ ठीक है, इस पर कोई एतराज़ नहीं होना चाहिए. मिर्जा नासिर, जहाँ जवाज़ है वहाँ ठीक है. Where there is a reason, it is right. जाजा बख्तियार, अच्छा जी. मिर्जा नासिर, वजूब है वहाँ नहीं. वाजिब मीन्स मसलन अगर कोई कानून ये बना दे कि 5 शादियां जरूर करो. Mirza Nasir saying now if there is a law that everybody has to marry 5 times, Jaja Bakhtiar, ये इसी पर मैं आ रहा हूँ. I am coming to that. Mirza Nasir, नहीं, वो तो बिल्कुल नहीं, वो तो फिर क्लैश हो गया. Now they're going to come to Mormons, which we are going to discuss in a short while. So what has just happened is that Mirza Nasir has fallen into the trap that there are certain parts of religion that are absolutely compulsory and certain which a law can be passed. I'm not going to point you to Article 9 of the European Union the Convention of Human Rights, which I've discussed in the Urdu video, the previous video in this series. Consult that, and that will tell you that according to Article 9 and the legal framework around it, everybody has the freedom of religion, but they divide it into three spheres. The legal scholarship on this divides it into three spheres. The religion inside you, nobody can take that away from you, and the state can never make a law outlawing what you believe. Common sense. It didn't used to be in the past, during the Spanish Inquisition and other sad phases of human history. Then there are those parts of the religion that are a must. You must gather together once a week for compulsory prayers. Fine. State should try not to make a law against these parts of the religion. For example, a Muslim says he has to go to the mosque on Friday. His employer says, no, you can't. I will not give you time off. If you take a case against employer, state will not say, sorry, you are employed by that person, and this is not a fundamental right of your religion. It's just an accommodation versus a fundamental right. Now, the third part sphere is those parts of religion that are not essential to the faith. States can make laws. That's the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 9. That is a guideline for all the European states on what kinds of law to make about religion. What kind of non-essential? For example, let's say the Shia community want to hold a procession in Amsterdam where they self-flagellate themselves with knives and cause a lot of blood. The government can pass a law saying, sorry, this won't happen. Or a place, if a minor child is kept without food and drink for 2 days. So the Attorney General is going to come to that soon. But here, Mirza Nasir Ahmad has already accepted the fundamental fact of what religious freedoms can be curtailed and what cannot be curtailed. Now, Ahmadis should think about it before my next video on this, continuing on with this conversation, and say what freedoms Ahmadis are allowed to call themselves Qadianis and Ahmadis. They are allowed to practice their religion in their own internal places of worship. They are allowed to use all the Islamic reserved words inside their place of worship, like Amirul Mumineen, Ummul Mumineen, the Islamic reserve word that cause a lot of anguish to Muslims, but they're not allowed to print them, they're not allowed to publish them, and they're not allowed to mislead Muslims and confuse Muslims with those words. So keep that thought in mind, and Jaja Bakhtiar will build upon this argument. He's already made Mirza Nasir Ahmad, convinced him that there are certain laws that can be passed that infringe on the freedom, but not the essential freedoms. In the example of the butcher, and the example of the person who wanted to slaughter a cow in India, and India does not allow you the slaughter of cows. With that, I leave you. If you have any question in your comments, send an email. We'll put an email and address and everything else. Thank you, and may Allah be with you.